Chapter 7, Third Sighting. The next time we got together, I initiated the conversation because Magic and I went over this many times, debating if what we were going to do wasn't going against our moral and religious convictions. There are some other things I want you to know about and what we are up to or against. I want you to know about the really weird stuff because I feel it is important. It is part of my intuition, and whether or not you feel with all of this, we aren't going against our moral and religious convictions. Okay, boss, someone said. First I said, right, and don't call me boss. I then laughed and started. I knew the theory would work, and this is the rest of what happened up in the wilderness before Donna. It was 1989 when I decided to go to Florida to work and rejoin the human race. After all, the adventure I was on had to end, just like the more extreme isolation of my camping experience had to end. It was fun and rewarding to be the minor mountain man, plus 6 years of relative pure beauty and living with a great woman named Peggy. I loved it. We made enough to leave, plus the fact that I had not seen any of my family for 7 years, and it seemed to the both of us we needed to change our paths. I sent Peggy ahead of me to Stockton to her mother's house, which was to be our last staging area before we left for Florida. I decided to stay there for a while longer in Hayfork to move the rest of what we owned with my van after selling most of what I couldn't take or needed to keep. When I left, I had waited just long enough to catch the beginning of the snow season in the higher elevation up in Wildwood. And as I came down in elevations in increments of 500 feet at a time, I passed through all kinds of weather changes, from snow to rain and then light drizzle, back and forth, warm then cold, always changing as I drove. It seemed as I came down in elevation every 500 feet, there was a different and well-defined change in the ecosystems. And each drop had its own climate and biosphere, depending on which side of the mountains you happened to be on, southern exposure or northern exposure, etc. It had been a few years or more since my personal encounters there, and more than 13 or 14 years since my encounter and sightings in my military days. As I drove on Highway 36 on my way to Red Bluff, I rounded a certain spot right before a section we called Roller Coaster Road, which is part of Highway 36, when all of a sudden, from behind a hill in a campground for kids, I spotted that same craft that I'd seen 14 years earlier in the Army. This campground, which is sponsored by a large corporation, had a main very large gathering complex with what seemed to be 40 or so cabins for 2 or 3 occupants around it on the slope of a small hill. From behind that main building is where this craft rose up. I thought that was very strange, and not only that, but the guy that was at the controls this time seemed to be the same one that I witnessed before and in the same craft. I thought this was very creepy. So now I was really curious, and I decided to use my mind to talk to whoever he was if possible. There was no other choice, no other options. My hands had to be on the wheel and my eyes on the road. There was nowhere to pull over to observe. I don't know if I would have if I could. So I figured if this craft and person were so advanced, and if anything about ESP was remotely true, it might be the only way to get answers and communicate. Only this time, he seemed human, just like in the Army days. Just for the hell of it, I tried. As he lifted up from behind a hill to my right, I found as I traveled he started to pace my truck just slightly ahead of me most of the time. I found that creepy. Amy spoke. Army days? You haven't told us about that. I guess I will soon. Hang on. I started again. He paced me slowly at my right side, but with that terrain between us, which was hilly, and now with more oaks blocking my view from time to time. This was scary in more than one way, as I could only glance occasionally. He paced me at about 300 to 500 yards, average distance depending on the terrain that he had to travel around and the terrain I had to drive around. As he traveled along the same path and direction I was traveling in, I had no idea what this was all about or why. I considered what I had read or heard about UFOs from the past, from what other documented and from what others had documented, and I wasn't going to stop out here, and I couldn't. It was too dangerous. The guy at the controls looks eerily familiar, and it was freaky. If I didn't know better, I would say he was an old friend somehow. It was the weirdest thing. I had seen this thing before in the Army. Magic said quietly, "Time traveler?" Questioning, drawing them out of their box to think for a moment. This caused a debate, some of them agreeing and some of them not. Talk of time travel can get deep. After that interjected, I started again. Or after that interjection. This is what happened before I built my first working model, and now even more reason and why I tried to build it. After all, how many times does a person need to see this type of physics before trying to do something about it? This was another closer view again of this type of aviation and physics. I developed my theory up in the mining fields and didn't apply it till about 6 years later, after this next incident I'm telling you about. Meanwhile, this object kept pacing me. I knew it was superior to anything known on the planet just by seeing what I could at this time. At any rate, I figured I might get an answer if I asked in my head, like before, questions. But more to the point, like, what is your power source and where does it come from? It was then during a straight part of the road that the craft turned on its side and showed me the bottom of the ship. It was answering, but not directly. I was really friggin' amazed that I was seeing a result, an answer. I knew right then that ESP works also. That whole night was puzzling till now. As we all know, this thing had a solid gray bottom with about 8 solid crystals that were lit up and glowing with all the colors of the visible spectrum sticking out of its underbelly. Then it flipped back to the original position. I now understood witness accounts of a wheel on its side. It reminds me of the biblical account in Ezekiel and how it looked to him as a wheel. It was being coy, though, and I knew it. But I now knew that it heard what I was asking like before. So I got more relevant. I asked, where does your power source come from? The answer was New Mexico. I couldn't believe that. This was the way it was going to go? Riddles? Really? I was expecting a different answer from a different source. Now it was rather depressing. Its response to me seemed partial, like it wasn't all coming through. It was breaking up as I received it, and it seemed it was relating the answers metaphorically. But why would it answer that way? John said, just like the first time up there with the square object. I said yes, in a sense, except in these instances, you have a visual that didn't seem to go with the theme at all, but at the same time seeing more clearly. Very strange. He was tracking me for a reason, and I couldn't quite pick up on the reason. I came out of Red Bluff about now, and I had been going east, and I haven't seen him for about 3 miles now because of the buildings in town and businesses. I figured that I had lost him. It's gone now. And that was all I would see. I wondered if I had been sleep driving or if I hallucinated or something. It was too crazy to accept. If I was sleeping and driving, I don't think I would have made it through the roller coaster part of Highway 36. I got to Interstate 5, turned onto the exit, and headed south about a mile down the highway. The craft reappeared. It was to my right and west of me, and I could not believe that I was seeing it again. I asked if this was the same one I seen about 15 years ago. His answer was yes. I said, why? More than once I asked. No answer. I asked, what makes your craft move? It turned sideways and showed me the bottom again. The placement of the crystals was perfectly symmetrical and in a circle. Because it seemed he was deceptive, I became cautious. He wouldn't tell me the exact answers I wanted to know. I definitely thought this was to hide something, but why make contact? I even pulled over and rolled down the passenger window so there wasn't anything between myself and what I was looking at. It still looked the same and also stopped. I had to believe there was a reason for all this. There had to be, but it was so far unclear. It was as if I was being blocked now from a very important piece of information. All I get is paradox. I asked one more question, and it was, how do I know you are telling me the truth? The answer came back, you will know in New Mexico. Hindsight is 20/20. He was making a rhyme out of the answer. I thought to myself, WTF? This is the same craft I seen at Fort Campbell. 1,000 questions and no answers. It seemed just more questions. Whoa, back up, Drew said. What happened at Fort Campbell? Hold on, I'll get to that. I continued. Well, here's the thing. I wasn't going to go through New Mexico as far as I knew anytime soon. So I put it out of my mind at this point. What else could I do? There was no way I was driving through New Mexico. I had planned to go to Stockton and stay for a while. I was going to take the northern route to Indiana and help my family move to Florida. What I thought was going to happen in a certain order didn't. I was late and had to go to Florida now, and I went through New Mexico. And the only part of that state I saw was a sign that said we were on Highway 666. And a few minutes later, it seemed we were out of that state. That was strange. Was that a coincidence? I don't know. And I don't know how to put that into any kind of context, because Peggy was driving through that state till I woke up. Holy crap, Drew said. Whoa. What happened at Fort Campbell? Amy now asked again. Okay, what I seen that night I saw years before. One day while out in the field on maneuvers, a friend of mine, John McGarrett, came around and said that we were going to move on a 17-mile forced march to attack the enemy's position and get ready to move out, and we needed to roll it up. We had been out there for about 3 days. We marched out at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on our way to attack an enemy's position. It was early when we headed out. It was also hours to get there on foot. Well, that march was long and grueling. It took us about from 4 to about 11 that evening to get within a close distance to where we could set up and drop some gear to attack. They were dug in and camped south of the road we were walking west on now. We got to our position on the road and prepared to go into the woods to attack. We were told that no one was to remain behind on the road and that everybody was to attack and participate. They didn't tell us too much about what was to take place, except that after a group of helicopters, 6 to be exact, attacked first, we were to advance. So we waited, and then after about 10 or 20 minutes, the choppers arrived. The choppers came in from the north, heading south along a stand of oaks. They then turned due west, still following that block of oaks on the south side of it. They followed the edge of the trees as a marker because they were flying low. If the trees were 30-foot average, then they were 10 or 15 feet above them and followed next to them. They flew slightly past us and then abruptly turned south again. One behind the other, they were to soften up the enemy's position with their armament. We were supposed to follow in behind them, guns blazing. So I watched them, one at a time, come around the corner of the stand of the oaks, and I counted them. There were 6, but before I could turn and attack like the rest of our company, there was a 7th that came around that corner. That wasn't what we were told. This one seemed to lag behind, and it started to slow down. It stopped right near there and hovered in place without a sound and absolutely no movement or deviation as it hovered. That kept me mesmerized. So I stayed on the road to observe the observer. At first, I thought I was misinformed about the number of helicopters they said would be participating. They didn't. This one was not one of ours. I had been trained to know the difference of many military vehicles and aircraft, but this one was unlike anything I had ever seen. I turned to get someone else's attention, but they were all gone now, and I was alone observing. I could hear all the guns suddenly firing and the yelling and all the explosions associated with war, but I just stood there watching. I could have thrown a rock and hit it. It was no more than 80 to 100 feet from me. I wondered if it could see me, and then the short hairs started to stand up on my neck. It was blacked out somewhat, kind of like stealth, but we didn't have that technology back then. It was disc-shaped, and it had a row of square windows in the front. It wasn't spinning, there were no lights spinning, but it looked very much like a saucer. It hovered, and no sound came from it. No prop, no jet, no turbines. There was a person sitting behind what appeared to be a console. Suddenly, he stood up and walked to the back wall and began to do something to the equipment that was mounted behind where he sat. He was working on what I thought was a large-sized computer mounted on a back wall. It appeared to be like something they would use in industry. The craft did not fluctuate at all as it hovered. It was as if it was locked in position. It had no markings that I could read like most military craft would have on them. I didn't see any weapons or missiles on it either. The choppers were long gone and still heading south. I could hear them off in the distance. Soon the shooting was over, and it took a few more minutes for the rest of my company to regroup on the road. As I waited for some of the others to arrive, this guy sat back in his chair and the craft started to move again. It then flew backwards, exactly the way it came, around the corner of the stand of oaks. First east, then it did a turn north. Here's the really weird part. All of its flight was being done in reverse. In other words, it was flying backwards without turning into the direction of flight, as if it were receding back into something, like it was being pulled along by an invisible force. It had not wavered in its elevation or distance from the ground at all, and was totally silent. It seemed to me it followed its exact course in reverse. It was the strangest flight maneuver I had ever seen. It never turned around from what I could see, as you would expect in crafts of that era or any other era. Then it was gone. I just wanted you to know that this sort of thing, except for on rare occasions, doesn't happen all the time, and there are many years that separate sightings of the unidentified in my life. But the military did train me to be a good observer, and my life depended on that training. What I never expected was that I would see that same craft again some 15 or more years later, and as I explain that, I have to add the really unusual thing is that guy behind the console looked familiar, like the person piloting that craft in California as I drove on Highway 36. It's damn sure weird. Someone asked, "What do you think of that sighting?" None of it at the time made sense. I didn't know what any of that meant at the time. No matter what, it seemed to be trying to get something across or just curious about something. I didn't know then, and not till later. Carl chimed in. If we consider that the theory and hypothesis is correct, then we can extrapolate from what you said, which would mean someone can't make the connection with you somehow. But then you did see something important. That confirms that crystals are important, and we will find that out sooner rather than later. It's like a message was being conveyed but not received at the time, or maybe it was. Exactly. Maybe just enough to push me into all of this, because after I arrived here in Florida, I already was pushed into making that first working device. Then I met the rest of you and figured with all of our backgrounds, we would have one heck of a team. This is when I decided to get all of you together. Just the odds of finding the right people to put this all together is high to none. And look how far we have come. Magic, as you all know, is an electrical engineer and a brilliant mathematician. Drew was our go-to man for welding with any metals and types from TIG to MIG and stick. Mechanical work too. Plus, it is his shop and Magic's property we are on. You work for Harris and Semantics. Drew is a pilot also and owns planes, and both Magic and Drew are letting us use their property to do the project, and all of you are computer whizzes. Amy is an electrical engineer and knows all about telecommunications, so I can't see anything but success. We all have talents that fit right into place, and I realized we all had the technical ability to put this all together. And there was a ton of information already established on the net about this and how to build certain parts of this, but no one till now had the magic combinations to actually make it happen. Till now. No pun intended, Magic. No pun intended. Magic took over. None taken. Before we make that third working model, I had to sort out the circuitry with a crystalline structure. Then Magic said, and if we are going to defeat gravity and gather power from the vast electromagnetic fields of Earth, this may be the way. Crystals will amplify the reaction and frequencies, and I think that may do it, but we'll have to grow our own quartz crystals, which will be trial and error, but not impossible. There's definitely a way. We would need to make crystals, large crystals, that deliver and produce the piezoelectrical effect. Then he added, superlamination theory. This solution states that from infinity, from all directions to a point, flows a radiation, and that is mostly magnetic in nature and with a small electrical component. This radiation has a velocity of c squared, the speed of light squared, or 10 billion times faster than that of visible light. This energy can possibly account for what we call the atomic weak force. This may also help explain why both Tesla and I have calculated propagation velocities faster than the speed of light in our experiments, when normal propagation velocities are expected to average around 85% the speed of light. 0-point energy would have to have a velocity very much faster than the speed of light if it is the causal force of our universe, and it would have to be absorbed by matter, or more correctly, energy domains. Atoms follow the basic rules of our mechanical universe. If 0-point energy is behaving as a fluid, mechanical laws can account for many observations and gave us a better understanding on how to accomplish our mechanism. Magic Square was a genius. He was already building the third craft in his mind. He knew where to take this, and it was into the universe. We didn't know how or why we were all drawn together exactly, but learning after being together and talking, we learned that we all had special talents to be drawn together for this project. We learned that we all had these 6 senses, from ESP to telekinesis. Why we had these abilities, we would learn later. We also knew that there was another force detached from this as well, pushing us into this. Call it what you will, at least for now. Next, Chapter 8, Rules.